Hi, this is Geoff Berry, and welcome to the Nature Calling channel, where we aim to deepen connection to the earth and to the spirit of life and to all our kin on this beautiful planet.
Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming along. My name is Dr. Geoff Berry, and I'm here to present to you on ecotherapy, otherwise known as nature healing, and really an umbrella term for lots of stuff. So for people who like being in nature and get good feelings out of it, anything you've done that has brought that on for you, that's part of this. That's a nice, easy way of putting it. So first of all, let's do an acknowledgement of country. It's a real great pleasure to be here on the ancient lands of the Muwina here in Nipalina. I always like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also just invite you to take a few breaths and feel into what that means for you, so that it's not just a tokenistic gesture. To actually just give yourself a couple of breaths and stop and feel your body and your mind and where you are. Just feel into this place, just next to the waterfront, Hobart or Luna. And just give a couple of moments to acknowledge the people that have been here for a long time, that have taken care of this country. And we're using country here in the sense that Aboriginal people use the word with a capital C, which means, as it was paraphrased by Deborah Bird-Rose, an enlivened spiritual cosmos. So a place to be that is land, sea, rivers and mountains, forest. And also not just us people, but all of the other beings that are our relations. So the other animals, which of course we share a good 98% of our DNA with, our cousins, also the planets and the elements, and just the whole idea of place, of Earth and of the universe as a living place, as a living ecosystem that we're a part of. So a lot of the way we work in ecotherapy, as I will go more deeply into shortly, utilizes mindfulness techniques or awareness practices, depth psychology, so the myths and symbols, and some of the other ideas about archetypes, shadow and so forth, through Jungian psychology, and also Indigenous wisdom and ancestral knowledge. And so Indigenous wisdom to the place where we are, which is why it's always important to pay respects to the original owners, the people of the land, but also the ancestral wisdom that's still a part of our genetic and cultural DNA, which is something that we can tap back into fairly easily, even though we're quite disconnected from it. And that's probably, I guess, one of the great themes of ecotherapy is why don't we feel like we're completely at home and a part of nature more often, like more completely? Because of course that's exactly what we are. We're animal beings that have built up urban environments only over the last 10,000 years or so. But in fact, 99% of our evolution, as all human evolution, was spent in very close contact with nature, including, so anyone here with European ancestry, which is probably going to be all of us to some extent, has some kind of ancestry in what was known as the Great Forest before it was colonised by the Romans. So we're only looking at a few thousand years there. So I think a part of what ecotherapy wants to do is to get us back to a feeling of belonging in place and in nature, in a way that helps us to breathe easier and just feel better. I know that's just the simple shorthand of it. Derek, we can start to move through the slides, that'd be great. So that's just my general intro. I know that because this is Hobart and because this is Wild Island with all this absolutely beautiful nature-inspired art, I already know that I'm speaking to the converted in one sense, right? Almost everyone you meet in Tasmania loves nature in some way or other. Certainly people who love to shop love nature even more specifically. So I know that I'm on an easy win here today. Thank you very much for all being nature lovers in the first place. So again, just before we kind of go back to the presentation, as it were, I invite you just to have a look at some of these words, which are words that often come up when we do ecotherapy. I've already mentioned belonging, the idea that it's better for us to feel like we belong. Alienation, feeling isolated, feeling separated, they're very rarely good things. Like in some ways they can be helpful, right? We go through process development through our lives. Sometimes we have to differentiate ourselves from our parents, you know, when we're initiated into becoming our own person and so forth. But in general, we always want to belong somewhere. In our body, in a community, in a place. Presence. Feeling like we're really here, like we're not always sort of dissociated somewhere else. Nature speaks for itself, feeling like we're at home in nature. Home, it's a word I might come back to again later on. And spaciousness, this is one that comes up a lot, I find, when we do ecotherapy. And I'll come back to what that might mean in lots of different ways, but let's just say, for an introductory idea, that it's just taking therapy or psychology or counselling out into nature. So rather than two people sitting in a room, which again, if you look at the entirety of human evolution, is actually quite a strange thing to do, and getting back into nature. And when I've had sessions with people, both myself as a client and as a therapist, I've noticed it too, and I've definitely had a lot of people say to me, I just feel so spacious. I don't feel cramped by my mind and my ideas about myself and what I think I'm supposed to be doing. There's a lot of unlearning in ecotherapy. Just dropping the socialized ideas about how we think we're supposed to behave. So, just let those words resonate a little bit. See what comes up for you. Before I start talking about ecopsychology, which is the theoretical basis for ecotherapy, just see which one grabs you again. Just give yourself a couple of breaths to settle in. And just see what resonates for you out of that. It might be something that you feel like you'd like more of, or it might be something that you feel very comfortable with. And really, what ecotherapy is, for me anyway, for a lot of people, is ecopsychology in practice. Ecopsychology, actually I might even just break it down first of all. I'm sure some of you will know this, but it comes from three Greek words. And eco is actually from oikos for home. So ecology is really like the home system of the planet. Psyche being, originally soul, actually, but it's become translated very often as mind. Again, in Greek, and ology is the study of, the logos, the rationale of the mind in the home. In this sense, the soul of people on planet Earth, on the place that they feel like they belong. So Theodore Roszak, he was 92, publishes a book called Ecopsychology, and he was really quite radical at the time. He was like, okay, so a very famous Jungian therapist and really a thinker asked the question, we've had 100 years of psychotherapy and the world is still getting worse. What's going on here? And Roszak picked that up and said, maybe we missed something. Maybe it's because psychology is still sectioned off from our actual, and so obviously he's a guy, again, like all of us, who's just comfortable getting out in nature and recognizes that it gives you something. And it's like, why are we doing this separately? Why do we have nature over here and psychology over here. That's just a really strange thing to do when you think about it. But, you know, once you have, it's a bit like civilization. Once you have it rolling, it kind of takes on its own logic. And it's a little bit like urban environments. You know, we think urban environments are natural. Of course it is. You go out in the city and there are straight streets. But actually that's an invention, right? And then you're enculturated into it, you're socialized into it, and you think, right, that's normal. We're very adaptable beings, so that makes a lot of sense. But very quickly, of course, the question comes out from any academic enterprise like ecopsychology. So what? What do you do with this stuff? It's great to know that. But what does it change? What's the point? And so the point became, well, ecotherapy, let's start to do that. And some really courageous psychologists and therapists started to do exactly that, to take people out and to say, oh, why don't we do it in the backyard? There's a few of the really famous operators literally just said, let's just go outside. And then sometimes clients would ask for that. I'm feeling really kind of claustrophobic. Can we like step outside? Oh, my breathing is here. And so there were a lot of things that really started to inspire the growth of it. So it's a kind of a strange space at the moment because it's growing at an incredible rate, at an exponential rate, but it's still absolutely tiny. So it's like exponential here. The curve's really high, but you know, it's still not really having a huge effect. As usual in Australia, we're a little behind. Although there are some really great people working in this country under different kinds of terms and doing different kinds of practices. So many of you will be aware of things like rewilding. Women's circles are really big now. It's something that's probably just built up over the last 20 or 30 years. Adventure therapy and wilderness rites of passage are really big, something I'm really interested in because a lot of my studies were around things like ritual, the loss of ritual and things like that. And it's definitely in the anthropological literature, you'll see a lot of this, recognizing that when you have large urban civilizations, you lose a lot as much as you gain, right? And a lot of what we lost was, things like initiation rituals, taking children, turning them into adults, sometimes in very, very brutal ways, but nevertheless, something that's kind of missing in modern society. Let's see what comes up next. Okay, so I said I would mention the three different sort of areas that go into nature healing, ecotherapy, ecopsychology, mindfulness. So as a friend of mine once said, I've got heaps of my friends live in the country, Geoff, but they don't think like this. They're driving around in cars and, getting pissed and watching football. They don't care. And I realised it was actually great. It's really good to be challenged by people. It made me realise that the difference is being mindful, is spending time in nature where you are not just thinking about what someone else said or what you've got to do tomorrow or who you are in a relationship or what did I forget on the shopping list. All that mundane stuff, which is fine, it's part of life. But having some kind of meditation or mindfulness practice that enables you to let that go a little bit, just to create some space, again, that spaciousness, to say, that's okay, my practice is Zen. I'm sorry, I didn't really introduce myself. Hi everyone, I'm Geoff. I have a Zen practice. I did mention I have a PhD in psychology. I have a master's in dreams and symbols and myths. And I've worked a lot with Aboriginal Australians on the mainland. So not at all in Tasmania, but I set up an elders organisation where I live now on the south coast of New South Wales. So I was the inaugural CEO of that. And I've worked with anthropologists and elders who've authorised me to speak about their stories. As we all know, a respectful thing to do nowadays is to let Aboriginal people tell their own stories. So I never tell their stories, but I was given authority to talk about them. So sometimes I'll introduce a songline or a dreaming and I'll say, this is what the people believe about this. Just that surface level introductory stuff. But my mindfulness practice is Zen, put simply, direct relationship with nature, trying not to look for anything else, trying to let all that other stuff go, trying to let my socialized self go, try to allow the thoughts that arise to be, because I don't want to reject them or suppress them. That only creates another problem later. But just to say, oh, there's another cloud in the sky, here I am. And I found that very, very helpful. But it doesn't matter. I don't pitch for any particular type of mindfulness practice. There are a lot of good ones. And of course now there are Western mindfulness practices. So there's a lot of different ways to learn to let yourself be. But like most Buddhist practices, self-compassion is a big part of it, as well as compassion for others. But the main thing for ecopsychology or ecotherapy is that ability to just be, to bring some presence to the moment, to try to be with the moment as if it were the only moment, just to be a conscious body-mind, or as I like to say, a self-aware primate in space, in a place that you can really connect with. And that brings us to point 2, Indigenous wisdom, elders, and kinship with country. So when I first studied anthropology back in the 90s at Deakin, the theme that was being taught to us was that Indigenous cultures pretty much everywhere, they're always really complex and different, but if there's a theme, it's about identification with place. It's like, we live here, this rainforest is it. We live here, this desert is where we live. We're the people, this is the place. In a very positive way. It can seem quite limiting now because we have such a global 24/7 instant information life going on. Consciousness seems very complex in another way, but there's an infinite complexity to being identified with one place. Something I like very much, to just be in a place and to get to know it. So in ecotherapy, we do a thing called sit spot, which is just going back to the same place all the time and getting to know it really deeply and just noticing the little things. And often, this will lead to 3, but I don't want to jump there too quickly, getting a lot of metaphorical knowledge about life out of that. Stories about how life works, just watching the way ants will rebuild a nest, or even just recognizing the way grass moves in the wind. And I was thinking, oh yeah, I get that. I get a feeling out of that reminds me of what it's like to just be alive in a place, and to let some other things go. Which is not to say that ecotherapy is about, it's not a happiness paradigm. This is not a positive psychology trip. Sadness, grief, they're all welcome. It's about being real. It's about being real with yourself and getting over the stories that are keeping you stuck, let's say, in certain paradigms. So working with something like sadness or grief is definitely a part of what we want to do. We want to be real with that if that's what's happening for us, and let that wash through us until it naturally has done its work with us, and then we become another person, and hopefully a person with a broader, deeper perspective. So identification with country was the thing that was first introduced to me about Aboriginal life, pretty much anywhere. In terms of Indigenous wisdom, caring for country, something I already mentioned, knowing how country works, knowing what to do in certain times of the year according to certain signals. So again, just getting to know nature better also makes us more intelligent in terms of natural intelligence. Deborah Birdrose introduced me and many people to these kinds of ideas working with the Yarralin people, I think it was, in the Northern Territory. Things like, when that kind of daisy flowers, that's when the crocodile eggs will be out. So you can start to go looking for the crocodile eggs, the seasonal things. Seeing a lot of nods, it's so amazing because people have really got to know this now. And now you can get like Aboriginal seasonal calendars in a lot of places around Australia. It's amazing. And I just finished reading Fire Country by Victor Stephenson about fire culture. And he talked a lot about that kind of stuff too. When you see this kind of tree flower, you can burn off that type of country, things like that. And that burning, that's a really healthy thing. So Indigenous wisdom, a lot to do with knowledge of place. And I will say, again, just off to the side, initiation ritual, things like that, ways of working with consciousness that for me are often a lot more profound than what modern society might offer. And I'm not writing down modern society either, but just pointing out that, you know, if we allow ourselves simply to be caught up in the sort of 24/7 screen time, proliferation of consumption and consumerism story, then we might sometimes also be missing something a lot deeper that we could be doing with this wild life we have that's going to end. Elders, you know, keepers of knowledge. I'm starting to get really interested in how we might tap into older people in modern society becoming elders, as well as working with Indigenous elders. People who understand silence. It might seem strange because I haven't stopped talking for half an hour, but I have a deep love for silence, for being still in nature, and for doing deep listening, which is another thing Miriam Rose made really popular. Fantastic teacher, deep listening, and since then I've come across lots of different teachers. But you know, my main teacher has been nature, has been actually just doing the practice, just sitting in a place, allowing those human thoughts to pass by, and just to be filled with the healing and the unstoppable force of nature. You look at something in nature, an animal that gets hurt, it wants to heal. Look at a tree that hits a rock, it grows around it. Like, nature will teach you how to become more resilient and more deep and connected if you allow it to. There you go. I should have just said that. The rest of the talk is. Kinship with country. This is a really important one and quite radical. Because if you do start to allow yourself to feel the way that nature is, you recognise, I take Thich Nhat Hanh as a great teacher, the recently passed venerable Vietnamese Zen monk, came up with a beautiful phrase. I was trying to work with this concept for years, and he just said it in one word: interbeing. If you recognise that when you wake up in the morning, the first thing you do is you breathe, whether you're aware of it or not. You can't live for more than a few minutes without breath, so air is literally keeping you alive. I think it's only respectful to give thanks for fresh air. And then it just keeps going though. Then it's fresh water, and then it's soil, without which you don't have plants, without which you have nothing to eat. And all of a sudden you realise that literally your body and your mind and your entire life is extending out into the environment all the time, whether you're aware of it or not. So again, the awareness paradigm is simply waking up to the truth of the reality of who we actually are in place at any given time. What we are is not just this, what Alan Watts called the skin encapsulated ego. What we actually are is beings that are interbeing with each other, because we're social animals. We can't come into consciousness any other way. That are completely and utterly reliant upon the air and the water and the soil, and indeed the sun. So it stretches out into the cosmos and the stars in a way that makes us kin. And that's the important thing, that we've got another one of those things we've lost with modernity. That for Indigenous people, you know, you think about the kind of almost the cliche of the Native American being like, you know, my cousin the eagle, or my brother the bear, or something like that, because they've been made famous by popular culture. But that's a very deep reality. And a nice Australian way to bring it into a bit of grounding would be, where I live is black duck country. So it's the far south coast of New South Wales. It's Yuin country. My particular local tribal group is the Walbunja people. And actually the guy I'm thinking of doing is not Walbunja, but he's Yuin. And his totem is the black duck. So what that means is not just that he has to learn from the black duck, but it also means he can't eat the black duck, so he becomes responsible for that population in a way. And in having a system like that, so any Aboriginal person will have several different totems. They'll have a skin totem, they'll have a gender totem, they'll have where they are in the community, they'll have their personal life totem. And all of those things will be different relationships with kin. So they will literally think about that duck as their brother or their sister or whatever they think about. And I find that really helpful. And a lot of people I've worked with have found that really helpful because it really gives you a deeper grounding in your sense of being an ecological citizen or a part of the environment, which is still anthropocentric as if it's our environment, part of the Earth system. And I've spoken to like highly regarded climate scientists who really get this stuff. You know, talking about Gaia hypothesis and things like that. Yes, Professor Will Steffen up at the ANU has said to me, yeah, Gaia hypothesis is absolutely true, at least in the sense that it's just one system. Like he's a full, you know, guy with an international reputation. He's not going to start talking about the living organism of the earth, which the ancient Greeks certainly did. But he will say, yeah, it's just one system. It's just one system that's there to support life. And how we treat it in the Anthropocene, in the era when we're the most powerful force on the planet, for better or worse, will come down to how we feel about it, how much we feel like we belong here, how much we think the earth is worth, and how much we feel kinship. We actually feel love and respect and relationship and reciprocity, that we're going to do something and not just always be taking. So these are the kinds of things we talk about in terms of Indigenous wisdom. As I've mentioned, I work with mob where I live, and when I run a retreat, I invite a local elder to come and do a welcome for us. So I try to integrate that work into what I do, as well as, you know, always pay respect to my teachers when I pass on what they've allowed me to pass on. And then the other thing that's always involved in here, depth psychology, I've already mentioned, Geoff. And myths and symbols and stories. And one thing I learned from writing my PhD was that we live in a completely mythic era. I would argue that modern society is almost more mythic than the ancient Egyptians. So it's really funny. You get some things like, oh, they had Ra and they had the cats and the funny one and the pyramids and things. But honestly, the myth of today is so overwhelmingly powerful. That's why we can't change it. That's why capitalism has such a fierce grip on the way things are working. That's why deforestation continues. Because progress and profit and consumption are all-consuming story that we are caught up in. And partly I find it quite liberating to realise this, because I recognise that I've been socialised into that story, and there's a part of me that can't simply walk away. And in fact, we're all enmeshed in it now, the whole globe is. So it's about our relationship to that story. But I think it would be great if we could have a new kind of era of ritual initiation where people could actually learn how deeply immersed in the story they are. So often in modernity, we think we're so logical and we're so rational and we've gotten beyond all those mythic things. It's not true at all. All that's happened is that they've transformed into something, and I think sadly something very destructive and something not very supportive of your personal potential to be whatever you want to be. It's actually a very reductive myth in many, many ways. So getting to know the myths and the symbols and the stories we live by is super important. Like I've said already, I find often when I'm working with people in retreats, in ecotherapy training programs, which is mostly what I do, what we very often find ourselves doing is unlearning. And like I said, we have to be very comfortable with a part of that unlearning being very uncomfortable, as it will be. Whether or not because we're realising some sadness and grief that we've been hiding ourselves from because we wanted to live the Instagram dream, or because we realise we're part of a system that's destroying the earth, which is another side of what ecotherapy can do. And I think, sadly, it's going to be a growth industry. And I say that with deep irony because there's a lot lot more reports nowadays of people seeking ecotherapy, not just for their personal inner healing. Healing if we're wounded, empowerment if we feel like we've been taken apart a little bit, or just getting back in flow, right? It's not just for people who are broken, like me. It can also just be a way of well-being, if you like. So it's working across lots of different paradigms, all the way from really deep trauma. I've worked with some people that have really broken down with me about very serious abuse situations that they've finally been able to start to work with in a new way. All the way to, well-being programs, people who basically can afford to just want to reconnect to nature. They're all valid, right? We're all beings who are caught up in this story, deserve to have, to be able to live in a way that's more connected and makes us feel more belonging. So that's one way in which it can work across a few levels. The other way, which is very closely related, that ecotherapy can work in a couple of different ways, is one-on-one, so a therapist and a client in just going outdoors, or in fact, not even going outdoors. So you've got some people, of course, that would really struggle with that, but recognise that they might get something out of nature. So some ecotherapists will talk about that. They'll just have a picture or a couple of items from the area. Here's a rock, here's a stick, little things like that. Which one speaks to you? Which one do you want to talk about? Stuff like that. Looking out a window. Ecotherapy does. I recognise my privilege. I live close to nature, and all of us really are privileged living in this beautiful country, that we have nature pretty much on tap. So last year I gave 2 presentations to 2 different groups of people, one in Indonesia and one in South Portland in Brazil, and both of them were like, we just can't go. These are people that live in high-rise buildings in very big cities. They're like, we just can't go out to nature like you. So I said, okay, cool, right. Get a cactus on your windowsill. No excuses. You can do something. There's always something you can do. But one-on-one, but also group, like collective work. I really think there's a lot, this is happening in a really big way in the States and slightly less so in Europe, but I think that as people come more into the realization of the deep trouble we're actually in terms of climate change, just for a shorthand, there's a lot more than that, ecosystem breakdown, etc. What we're seeing, and this is all research and evidence, this is not just my anecdotal thing, but we were involved in the mega fire in the southeast of Australia, New Year's 2020, and now the floods in northern New South Wales. We had a few students that were really strongly affected by that. So I've been tracking the kind of the fallout of that, and a lot of that has been looking like what people could have done with more, and what seemed to work quite well was doing sort of forms of ecotherapy, just forms of reconnecting with other people in groups outdoors to deal with things like eco-grief. And also I think it's been reported a lot, especially in the UK, eco-anxiety. People recognising, oh my God, what have we done to the planet, and not really knowing what to do about it. And then realising, oh, it's actually because we haven't loved nature enough. So there's a few different levels where we can take this sort of deeper psychological story into ecotherapy. You just flip over. I think that might be it. Yeah. So I just like to mention, I've mentioned the PhD in the MA. I'm the Australian representative to the International Ecopsychology Society, so they're a really cool gang of people. I met in Hawaii in 2013, so I've been doing that for 10 years now, and going over to Sardinia in Italy to present with them this year. I'm running an advanced certificate in ecotherapy, so if anyone wants to train up to become an ecotherapist, you have to already have some kind of practice. So that's for practitioners and therapists who want to add ecotherapy to what they do. I mentioned my Zen and Indigenous work backgrounds. Nature Calling is kind of my tag. So I've got a website at naturecalling.org and a YouTube channel, Nature Calling. So at the moment I'm just putting up because it's this crazy time of year, I haven't been able to do a lot of my work with other people. I'm just putting up some just really beautiful videos of nature. A couple of exercises I've done in the past at retreats and things, but I'm going to keep on building that with having discussions with other people that are working in the field. There's especially a great Australian clinical psych over in WA, George Burns, who wrote a book called Nature Healing in 1998, so he's a real leader. Having a chat with him soon, and a couple of the other sort of big names in the States and Europe, and just trying to keep the conversation going.
Thanks for watching, and please consider liking this video. And if you want more content like this, subscribe, and the Nature Calling bell will toll for you. This is Geoff signing off.